Hello, everybody. We're going to move on now to chapter 23, in which we'll be covering the digestive system. And if you're following along in your textbook, I want to warn you that the textbook is going to provide a lot more details on the digestive system, and we're going to be covering, I don't even want to say a percentage, but I'm going to be leaving out some of the detailed information that your textbook covers, especially with regard to things like nervous system control of the digestive system. We're just going to bypass that. We can't cover every possible topic in your textbook and make it through the course, so I have to leave a few things out. Okay, so the digestive system is pretty interesting, and it consists of a long tube that runs from your mouth to the anus. And this tube is called the alimentary canal, and it has different structures that when we're chewing and swallowing food, and then it begins its processes of digestion and absorbing nutrients, absorbing fluids, and then finally generating the wastes that have to be excreted from the body. You have this one long tube that all of that's going to have to pass through from one end to the other. So that has a name. That's called your alimentary canal, from one end all the way down to the other. And of course, we'll be covering the anatomy over on the anatomy side for this particular chapter. Now, your digestive system does include a couple of accessory organs, or 3 accessory organs. Well, I guess also more than 3, because you can consider your salivary glands to be accessory organs as well. But those include the salivary glands up here that produce saliva. Saliva plays roles in helping us out with digestion. Then you have your liver, is actually considered to be an accessory organ of the digestive system. The gallbladder, which stores bile, and your pancreas, which produces most of the enzymes that actually digest your food. So we'll be studying those organs and what they do, in addition to the organs that make up the alimentary canal, which includes the mouth and the esophagus, the stomach, small intestine and large intestine, all of the different regions of those particular organs, many of which you've learned a little bit about before in A&P. I do want to clear up, misconceptions. One big misconception I want to clear up immediately here as we start the digestive system. Most digestion does not occur in the stomach, which we're going to be seeing shortly. The stomach certainly plays very important digestive roles, but most digestion occurs down here in the small intestine. That's where that takes place. So you really don't digest most food in your stomach. Most of the digestion takes place down in the small intestine. And also get out of the habit of referring to everything below the diaphragm as your stomach. But the stomach is a very specific organ which has very specific roles in digestion. But again, a lot of times when people say, oh, my stomach hurts, I've got the stomach flu, things like that, those are usually disturbances of the intestinal tract and not the stomach itself. So just wanted to clear up a couple of things there early. We want to try to use the correct terminology since we are learning anatomy and physiology, and you guys are, for the most part, planning to go into health sciences type careers. All right, so we're going to be learning about digestion. There are 6 essential activities of digestion that we'll be learning about, and these include ingestion, taking in food and fluids, propulsion, that includes things like swallowing, peristalsis, these are the muscular contractions that help force food and beverages along the alimentary canal from one end to the other. Mechanical breakdown. So digestion involves enzymes that help digest the organic molecules in our food into smaller and smaller parts, but we also have mechanical breakdown processes. The simplest is simply chewing your food with your teeth, but then your stomach really does churn. It does slosh of food that is in the beginning stages of being digested back and forth. Then there's a process we'll talk a little bit about called segmentation here shortly, where within the small intestine, food gets sloshed back and forth to kind of help break it apart and assist with the digestion process. Digestion involves numerous enzymes that break down the organic molecules that you're taking in from your food, like proteins and carbohydrates and fats for the most part. Absorption, you have to absorb nutrients, and the vast majority of that occurs in the small intestine as well, through the small intestine lining. And then those nutrients have to make it into your blood vessels. And fats are actually taken up into the lymphatic vessels. We talked a little bit about that when we covered the lymphatic system. So they actually go into lymph vessels first. So absorption is a big event of your digestive system. Defecation, that's the production of feces, undigested matter that has passed all the way through the alimentary canal, and you need to get rid of it. And that process is called defecation. So those are your 6 major processes of digestion. All right, when we're talking about digesting your organic nutrients, look on the back of you look on a nutrition label. What do you see on there? It's going to tell you the grams of carbohydrates and proteins and different kinds of lipids that you have in the foods that you're consuming. So those are the main nutrients that we're taking in. And why do we need these nutrients? There are 2 major reasons why we need them. You need them for energy. We break down these molecules. Energy is stored in the covalent chemical bonds of the nutrients that we take in. And if you break those molecules apart, that energy can get harnessed by your cells to make ATP. So there we go with cellular respiration again. We bring that up over and over. And then another reason why we have to take in these organic nutrients is we need these monomers. We need those. Monomers are building blocks. Okay, so when you eat carbohydrates and you break those carbohydrates down into monosaccharides or sugars, sugars can be used for energy, but you also have to bond sugars together in different ways to build your own carbohydrates that play important roles in our bodies. Proteins, yes, you can use protein for energy, but for the most part, when you're consuming proteins, you need those amino acids that are in those proteins to build your own proteins. Your cells need those to construct the many different kinds of proteins that they need to do their work. Remember, proteins are kind of generally the chemical workhorses of your cells. They play many different roles, and you have to build those from amino acids. So you need those from your diet. Lipids, not all lipids are triglycerides, but many of them are. And triglycerides are built from monomers called monoglycerides and fatty acids. A lot of times you learn glycerol and fatty acids. Those are building blocks of your triglycerides. And you need those to build things like your cell membranes, which are important for cellular function. A monoglyceride is a glycerol building block with one fatty acid attached. And then fatty acids are, a triglyceride has a glycerol and 3 fatty acids. A monoglyceride has a glycerol and 1 fatty acid attached, and 2 of them have been removed, just to make sure we're getting our terminology straight there. So when you see these things. Okay, so when we're talking about these nutrients, you really need to, in this unit, it's going to be important for you to be sure you know your building blocks of your major organic macromolecules, because we're going to be talking about these quite a bit. So this should be review for you, but carbohydrates are generally built from monosaccharides or sugars. We have different kinds of carbohydrates. Many of them can also be called polysaccharides. That means that they are chains of monosaccharides. Disaccharides are things like sucrose, table sugar, where you actually have 2 monosaccharides linked together. So that terminology should be reviewed. So should this, your proteins are built from amino acids. Those are the building blocks. And when you break down proteins during digestion, you guys are going to see it's a step-by-step process. Proteins are first chopped into shorter chains of amino acids. Those can be referred to as polypeptides. And at first they're fairly large. They get chopped into smaller polypeptides, but eventually you've got to break those apart into individual amino acids, because those are the absorbable monitors that are going to pass into your bloodstream and which are going to be transported to your cells so that they can use them to build the proteins that they need. And your lipids, like we were just talking about, many of the fats, lipids that we consume in our diet are in a triglyceride form, and those get broken apart into monoglycerides and fatty acids for transport throughout the body. Nucleic acids. Now, when you look on the back of a nutrition label, you don't often see DNA and RNA listed as important nutrients. And that's true. They're not super important for us, but DNA and RNA have to be broken apart into their building blocks as well before nucleotides, before they can be absorbed into the bloodstream out of the intestinal tract. So your goal with digestion is going to be to take these more complex molecules and break them down into their smaller absorbable monomers, those building blocks. So be sure you review that terminology. You don't want to wind up not doing well on the digestive system because you haven't learned your basic chemistry lingo. Digestion, when we're talking about this process throughout this unit, that is a catabolic process. Remember, metabolism consists of anabolism and catabolism. Anabolism, those are building processes that take place in the body. You're building bigger molecules from smaller parts. Catabolism is where you take larger molecules like these proteins and carbohydrates and lipids that we take in from our foods, and you break those down into smaller pieces. That's catabolism. And so digestion, of course, is going to be concerned with those types of chemical reactions. Digestion requires lots and lots and lots of enzymes. Enzymes catalyze chemical reactions. That should be a review for you as well. Enzymes are generally proteins, and these proteins have special jobs. Their jobs are to find particular types of chemical molecules and perform chemical reactions on them. That's what enzymes do. They make it more likely that these chemical reactions will actually happen, and these are chemical reactions that are required for us to stay alive, so you need these enzymes to force them to happen. Easiest thing to think about enzymes, think about them as little machines that perform critical chemical reactions. So we need various enzymes. Enzymes are very specific about what they do, so we need various digestive enzymes to help us break down these complex proteins and lipids and carbohydrates into their absorbable, smaller building blocks. And we'll also see as well that these digestive reactions that take place are generally hydrolysis reactions. You might remember that from Biology 201 as well. When you break apart something like a protein or a carbohydrate into its absorbable monomers, those types of chemical reactions are generally called hydrolysis reactions, because if you actually look at how those reactions take place, the enzymes that perform them use water molecules to help break those bigger molecules into smaller pieces. Water is added to those molecules to break the bonds. So you should have heard about that back at the beginning of Biology 201, so I'm not going to go back and rehash all of that, but hydrolysis was one of the early topics in A&P 1. All right, I mentioned that there are some muscular processes that are used to help out with digestion. So one of those is called peristalsis, and that's what you're seeing here. Peristalsis is kind of like squeezing a tube of toothpaste and pushing something forward. So if this is a part of the alimentary canal, Think about this being the small intestine. The walls of the digestive organs contain a lot of smooth muscle, and those smooth muscle tissues can contract for two different processes, peristalsis and segmentation. Peristalsis just means this part of the organ contracts and squeezes a bolus of food bolus. I'll use that term fairly frequently. That's basically just a wad of food that your digestive tract is dealing with. And it just keeps, this part contracts, and then this part contracts, and then this part contracts, and it just keeps squeezing that food bolus that's being digested forward. There's a different process called segmentation, and this is where you have contraction here, 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 and here, and then it switches, and you have contraction here, here, and here, and then it goes back to contracting here, here, and here. So adjacent segments of the walls of the digestive organ contract at different times, and what that's doing is it's sloshing food back and forth. That's the purpose of segmentation. So that helps. That's part of mechanical breakdown. And if you're thinking you've got all these enzymes that are helping you break down your food that you've consumed, and if you slosh it back and forth, it helps mix those molecules with the enzymes that are chopping them apart into smaller absorbable pieces. So that process is called segmentation. It's just basically sloshing a bolus of food back and forth. All right, this is kind of a generic diagram of an alimentary canal organ, but this is especially representing the small intestine. That's what we're primarily looking at here. And so the wall of the small intestine, which is where we'll spend most of our time talking about digestion, has many different layers. And all right, so here, a little bit of space right there, that's the lumen, or the space inside the organ where the food bolus is located. And then that is lined. You have a mucosa, or a mucosal lining. You know, we heard that term with the respiratory tract as well. And so right along the inside lining, you have epithelial tissues. You may have looked at those fairly closely when you were studying tissues in Biology 201. That's a simple columnar epithelial lining along the lumen there. And then just deep to that lining, you have some connective tissues and a little tiny thin layer right in here of smooth muscle. So all of those three things are called the mucosa. The lamina propria, that term that you see there, that's a little thin layer of connective tissue that separates that epithelial tissue lining with that little thin layer of smooth muscle tissue that you see highlighted on the diagram right there. Then if you move deeper into the wall, you have an area called the submucosa, and that's connective tissue. And if you look at the submucosa over here, you've got blood vessels in there. In yellow, you see nerve fibers. The nervous system does control your digestive organs. Your digestive organs are generally stimulated by the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system and inhibited by the sympathetic nervous system. Because that might sound the opposite of what you might expect to happen, but when you're in a stressful situation, like a fight or flight type situation, blood flow and so forth is actually diverted away from your digestive organs. You can finish digesting your food later. We need to conserve blood and resources for your skeletal muscles and your heart and your brain and so forth to help you survive some sort of crisis. So it's with the digestive system, the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system actually stimulates it. The sympathetic branch tends to inhibit it. Notice also within the submucosa and those connective tissues, you do have glands, submucosal glands. Those produce mucus and fluids that are sent through ducts Put a little pink strip that I was just highlighting there, so that those can be released onto the inside surface of the digestive organ. Now, if you keep moving outward away from the submucosa, you encounter quite a bit. You have two different layers of smooth muscle, and one layer is running around the wall this way, and then you got another layer where the smooth muscle fibers are oriented in that direction. So you need quite a bit. These are very muscular. Your digestive organs are very muscular, and they have to be able to accomplish the propulsion and the segmentation that takes place. And so because of that, you need these two different layers of smooth muscle tissue that help you accomplish those processes. And finally, if you keep moving outward, you get to the surface of the digestive organ, and there you will have thin layer of connective tissue, and this is also going to be where you're going to find your serous membrane covering, which they're peeling off for you there. So for down in the abdominopelvic cavity, that's going to be your visceral peritoneum. Remember that serous membrane that contacts many of the organs in the abdominopelvic cavity. Mesentery over here that's highlighted. Remember your mesentery, that consists of multiple folds of the serous membranes and provides tissues for the blood vessels and the lymphatic vessels that serve the intestinal tract. That's where you have your superior mesenteric artery and inferior mesenteric artery that we were learning about during the blood vessel chapter. So that's basically multiple folds of serous membranes that help anchor the intestinal tract in place. That's what that's referring to there. So that just kind of gives you an overview. You have a pretty complex structure associated with these digestive organs. All right, so what we're going to do in this unit, for the most part, we're going to start in the mouth and move our way on down from one end of the digestive tract to the other, and along the way we'll have to add in some of the accessory organs, the salivary glands and the liver and the pancreas, and talk about what they do. But for the most part, we'll be taking a journey with your food from one end to the other.